just really appreciate you taking time off your schedule to join us here live. There will be other people that will be watching it later, and we appreciate that. There will be time for question and answers. You can put questions in the chat room all along, and we will get to those at the end. But I'm just really happy to introduce my friend Efrem Smith, actually Dr. Efrem Smith. Efrem is a person that I have known for many years. And when we first met, he was a young urban youth worker in Minneapolis. And we got together, I think, for a lunch. And I walked away from that meeting and said, that's a person that two things about him. Number one, I really like him. And number two, I really respect him. He was a clear thinker about his ministry, even as a young leader, and he's continued that journey. And I continue to like him and respect him in profound ways as he's led a pastor of churches and a speaker and a consultant and a coach. Efrem is a man that I'm really excited to have you have a chance to listen to and learn from. So I'd like to welcome my friend, Dr. Efrem Smith. Efrem, you got the floor.
Hey, it's great to be with everybody. I should have renamed my Zoom box and just had it said Efrem. I think I was on some academic thing the last time I was on Zoom a couple of days ago. So I needed them to know, like, I'm the Reverend Dr. Efrem Smith. But yeah, it's just Efrem here. And first of all, let me give a shout out to, I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. So let me give a shout out to all my Minnesota brothers and sisters. I miss the people of Minnesota. I miss the walleye of Minnesota, but I don't miss the lutefisk or the mosquitoes of Minnesota, but everything else. I even miss the snow, believe it or not. So I am in Sacramento, California, co-lead pastor of Midtown Church, where we say we're a metropolitan, multi-ethnic, multi-campus church. And we're a part of a denomination called the Evangelical Covenant Church. So I believe there's a contingency of ECC folks on here. So shout out to y'all as well. But I am honored to be able to talk about basically the urban influence on youth culture and why all youth pastors, all youth ministry leaders, whether you're church or parachurch, whether you're located in the suburbs, in rural areas, that to a degree, I want to make the case that every youth pastor should think urban. Every youth ministry leader should think urban and make the case why I believe that to be true. So I'm going to share my screen here so that we can go through this this presentation on urbanization and its impact on youth culture. So I got to make sure I know how to. I was just teasing Tiger just a minute ago about him not knowing how to work his technology, and I'm on here right now trying to figure out how to make my PowerPoint slide go to the next one. So hold on a second while I try to figure this out here, because I might have to stop sharing and start over again. So hold on just one sec. See, this is what happens for teasing Tiger.
Yeah, right. It comes back to get you.
In front of you. And if for some reason I can't get this to work, it'll be okay, because I'll just, the PowerPoint was basically there to make me look smarter. And so if it doesn't work for some reason, then we'll just go with the real raw intelligence capability that I really have. But the PowerPoint is mainly meant to go, wow, look at that. Ooh.
Yeah, maybe the space bar or enter key or something.
Yeah, man, I'm pressing this, like, as I'm talking to you, I've hit the space bar 217,000 times. And so that didn't work for some reason. So that's going to sit there for a minute. But let me just start out by saying this. There is an urban influence on the United States of America. There is an urban influence on youth culture in general. And how that starts, sisters and brothers, is it starts with this reality. So one is, what is urban is expanding from the standpoint that you have these large growing metropolitan areas. When I was growing up, let's say in the Twin Cities, when I thought of what urban is, I basically thought of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And when you were outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul, you were outside the city. So if I was in Edina, if I was in Richfield, if I was in, Lord knows, if I was in Farmington or Shakopee, I'm like, I'm no longer in the city, I'm outside the city. But you have something now where you have the term metroplexes or metropolitan areas. So you might meet somebody and you say, where are you from? And they say, I'm from the Twin Cities. And they live in Lakeville. You know, they live in Savage. They live in Woodbury, because what the developers want you to believe, what the people in leadership want you to believe, is that the metroplex of the Twin Cities almost expands all the way to the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin. I've met people and I say, where you live? And they go, oh, I'm in Dallas, Fort Worth. And I go, well, what part? And they'll say, well, I live in Carrollton or I live in Richardson. I've met people that tell me they live in Dallas and they're actually closer to the Oklahoma state line than they are to downtown Dallas. But if you ask them where they live, it's almost like people don't want to try to explain to you, because they think, oh, you'll never know the town I'm really from. You'll never know the place I'm really from. So I'm just going to say that I'm from Atlanta, because to try to help you understand where Roswell is, that might take some time unless you grew up there. So you don't really know where it is. So I'm from Atlanta. But it's not just people use the names of cities that they don't technically live in to talk about, to make it easier to talk about where they're from. But it is also the reality that suburbs are becoming more like cities. Cities are and suburbs are becoming more, like cities, and rural areas are becoming more like suburbs to a large degree. Why is that? Well, one is because of gentrification. One strategy of urban renewal is to try to make changes in the center of cities that will bring people that are upper middle class, upper class, highly educated back into the city. So I was born in 1969. So the 1970s and the 1980s were really a time where, when you thought the center of a city, when you thought inner city, you thought two things based on what happened in the 1970s, 1980s, going into the 1990s. You thought downtown, and then you thought, oh, that's where the bad neighborhoods are. So there's downtown, and then right the next circle right around the downtown of a city like Minneapolis or Cleveland or Detroit or Atlanta are these inner city sections where there's poverty, where there's under-resourced schools, where there's housing projects. That's the inner city. And, you want to be careful how long you're in those parts, or maybe you can avoid those parts and not even go there. And so there were parts of the city, like a ring right around downtown, known as the inner city. And I grew up in South Minneapolis. So I actually grew up on the block where George Floyd died. So when I saw the video of George Floyd dying, that hit me a certain way, because the store that he had come out of, I bought more Hostess apple pies and ices and comic books, because before it was called Cup Foods, it was called O'Toole's Drugstore. and it was owned by a family. And, you know, I would shovel snow and rake leaves in Minneapolis as a kid, and I would go there and buy apple pies and Funyuns and ices, comic books. And then my grandmother would sometimes send me to the store, and she had like a tab there. She had an account there where I could just give Mr. O'Toole a list, and he would give me like lunch meat and bread and eggs and milk and stuff. And then once a month, my grandmother would send me back there to kind of pay off her account at this store. So I can vividly remember, like, if you thought urban, if you thought city, there was a limited way in which you would think about what is urban, what is a city. So I grew up urban, and there are probably terms that may or may not come to your mind that if somebody said, well, what is urban? What is a city? When somebody says urban, what do you think? Now, to a degree, some people automatically, when they hear urban, consciously or unconsciously think Black and brown, African-American, immigrant groups, the term of what has been labeled people of color, because especially when it comes to an African-American standpoint, you might have heard a term like urban radio. But when you turn and listen to, well, what is an urban radio station? They're playing predominantly songs by African-American artists. So some people think urban, and the first thing they think is that's African-American. That's where Black people live. That's where the inner city is. That's where under-resourced people are. But you can stereotype that so much that you lose sense that, you know what? There's a lot of under-resourced reality in rural areas. You can go to small towns in Mississippi, small towns in Alabama, small towns in South and North Dakota, small towns in Nebraska, and we don't talk about it that much. We don't present it in that way. But if you receive images after images after images of people living in a small town, living in an inner city, and there's crime, there's violence, there's brokenness, there's despair, that's the image you're going to have of what is urban. Where if you think of what is rural, what's the biggest image on television of being rural or being small town or being kind of in the country? Well, it's Yellowstone with the Dutton family. They're not poor, they're rich on that show. You know what I mean? I remember watching Little House on the Prairie as a kid. I didn't think they were rich, but I didn't think they were poor. They sure looked happy to me. The Ingalls family looked happy. The Waltons, when I watched the Waltons, they didn't look like, like when I watched Good Times, I knew they were struggling. But when I watched the Waltons, some of y'all are too young to even know what I'm talking about. When I watched the Waltons, I didn't think I was watching a struggling family navigating violence and despair and brokenness. When I watched Little House, even when I watched Dukes of Hazzard, they were breaking the law, but they sure look happy doing it. Every week on Dukes of Hazzard, Bo and Luke Duke were speeding, they were getting chased by the police, and we thought they were the heroes. If you would have saw an inner city urban movie where they were being chased by the police, you'd have said, those are the bad guys. Like, they're the bad guys. They're the ones we want to put in jail. They're the people we want to lock up. So see kind of the imagery, like some of us are old enough on this thing to know this is true, what I'm saying. When you thought urban, the images that were being thrown at us through television and movies and music, and like the most visible images were like despair and brokenness and crime and poverty, gangs and thugs and rap music. And then we could show the same kind of, we could show a rural community that had some of the same issues of despair and poverty and being under-resourced and having broken families and having dilemmas, but yet it was Dukes of Hazzard. They were breaking the law and they were the good guys. So when it comes to going, what is urban, I know it would be challenging for me to make this case that all of us should think urban, but for all of us to think urban, it has to start with what comes to your mind when you think urban. What makes a city a city? And how has urbanization changed everything? So let me say these things about, like, if you go way back, let's say back to the 1940s, the 1930s, like, what would people have thought about when they heard the term city? Like, for my parents and grandparents who grew up in the South, when they thought of city, they would say, you're going to town. Like, the city is the place you went because it was the center of everything. It's where the post office was. It was where the bank was. It was where the department stores were. So if you lived in a small town, like my grandparents on my dad's side, they lived in what's called Bosco Parish. And it is a small rural area outside of a city called Monroe, Louisiana. So when they thought city, they thought you go to town because that's where you take care of things. That's where you go buy stuff. We live here in this rural area, but we're going to the city because we have to buy groceries. We're going to the city because we need to buy clothes. We're going to the city because that's where the cities were once known as the center of everything, the center of politics, the center of commerce, the center of, all of the essential services that you needed. You need to go pay your utility bill, go to the city to go pay your utility bill. You need to go take care of your phone bill, go to the city. The city was the center of everything. By the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, this is where we have a tipping point of how people would understand, define a city, define urban. Now, some of that is because of the racial dynamics that were going on in the United States. You simultaneously had the Great Migration in the 1940s, 50s, 60s of African Americans leaving the segregated South, going to cities in the North, to the East, to the West, hoping for a better life. Just the flooding of African Americans out of Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, finding their way to Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, New York, looking for a better life, looking for access and opportunity, believing that these cities would be a better opportunity at equality and equity and access. And as that migration was happening, man, we don't have time right now to tell the entirety of this story, but we'll just say there were banks and mortgage companies, realtors that worked together to actually scare way too many white families into believing that this great migration would lower the value of their homes, bring brokenness, and so a lot, I'm not saying everybody that's in a suburb is there because of that form of white flight. That's not what I'm saying. But the suburbs are created in part because of banks and mortgage companies and realtors scaring many white families out of their urban homes. Because a lot of these suburbs that exist today did not exist in the 1940s and 1950s. There are suburban areas that it was just open land. I mean, there was probably cows and stuff on the land, horses. I mean, there were farmers there. Before that, there were indigenous people there. But what we know as the suburbs is a modern American creation, in part developed off the back of the racial dilemma in our nation and off of fears that were imparted into people's hearts for profit. So that changed the whole dynamic. So by the time I was growing up, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a stigma on what was urban. Now, you also have to understand, here's a little bit of youth ministry history. Think about this for a minute. At the same time that the Great Migration is happening, African Americans are coming from the South to cities in the North. At the same time that suburbs are being developed in part based on fear, based on intimidating narratives. At the same time as that, professionalized youth ministry in the local church and outside the local church is being developed in the United States of America. Parachurches are forming, Young Life, Youth for Christ, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Before that, the YMCA and YWCA as Christian organizations. At the same time that what is urban is being reformed, that all of a sudden urban is the place you go to get your essential needs met, to, for some, the place you fear, the place you don't go to, the place of crime and despair. At the same time that that is happening, youth ministry is being developed in terms of organizations that are solely committed to youth coming to Christ and growing as disciples. Also, the local church beginning to hire people on staff, or even if they're not paid, acknowledging and recognizing people in the local church as being there solely, primarily to develop ministry geared towards youth. The same time that what is urban is being reformed, youth ministry in a professionalized way is being formed. So by the time I was in seminary learning what youth ministry history is, what's the biblical theology of youth ministry, what are the practical models of youth ministry, the youth ministry models that I was being taught were based on the youth ministry models that were developed as what is urban was drastically being changed, the narrative of what is city. So when I came along, for the most part, youth ministry was taught from the standpoint of what does youth ministry look like in suburban churches? What does youth ministry look like in parachurches? So by the time I became an urban youth pastor, it was hard for me to find a book, find a class, find a seminar, find a conference that was contextualized for the way I was doing youth ministry. I had to go and learn about, so I grew up in the Twin Cities, right? So I had to learn how they were doing youth ministry at Wooddale Church, at Colonial Church. I had to learn how they were doing youth ministry at Grace Church of Edina. I had to learn how they were doing youth ministry at Berean Baptist Church in Burnsville, and then try to take that and shape it to fit my context in Minneapolis. And I found out around the country that I had peers that were doing the same thing. There were people in Chicago looking at how they were doing youth ministry in Naperville and trying to take what was going on in Naperville and make it work in Chicago. There were people going to a suburb of Houston, going to Galveston and seeing how they were doing youth ministry in Galveston so they could figure out how to do youth ministry in Houston. Matter of fact, if I'm honest, the suburbs was shaping urban youth culture. When I was a teen, I saw how suburban kids were dressing, and that's how I wanted to dress. I wanted the polo shirt with the animal on it. I can't even remember what brand that was, but you could get these shirts that had an alligator on it or a fox on it. And I was like, man, I want to dress like that. I wanted to wear Izod socks when I was in high school. I wanted to wear penny loafers with a penny in it. But I had bigger dreams, so I put a nickel in my penny loafers because I had bigger dreams. But you know what happened? By the time we hit the late 1990s, I discovered something. There was a shift by 1995, it was becoming visible that instead of suburban youth culture shaping all of youth culture, influencing it, all of a sudden, urban inner city youth culture was starting to, inner city urban youth culture was starting to influence suburban, quote unquote, white youth culture. This was written about in the 1990s in a book called A Tribe Apart by Patricia Hirsch. She's the first one to name this. And Patricia Hirsch was not a youth pastor. Patricia Hirsch was a journalist that decided to spend about, I can't remember if it was like 5 to 7 years, basically walking with teenagers and studying adolescence. She basically wrote this book to prove that there was a very visible generation gap between suburban teens and their parents' generation. But here's something that she writes in this book. And the funny thing is this chapter is called Negative is Positive. Think about this for a minute. I'm reading to you from a chapter where she's going to talk about how inner city youth culture is influencing suburban youth culture. And the chapter's called The Negative is Positive. She says, it's hip hop in suburbia, the culture of rap. Everywhere students wear baseball caps turned backwards or pulled down over their eyes, oversized t-shirts, ridiculously baggy jeans or shorts with drop crotches that hang to mid-shin and waists that sag to reveal the tops of brightly colored boxers. Expensive name brand high tops complete the outfit. Variations on the theme are hooded sweatshirts with the hood worn during school and do-rags, bandanas tied on the head, a style copied from street gangs. In the latest exasperating challenge to adult society, Black rage is in as the cultural style for middle-class white kids. Wow. She says, so today's adolescents have co-opted inner city Black street style as the authentic way to be. To act Black, as the kids define it, is to be strong, confrontational, a little scary. Everybody would be proud to be Black lately, explains a saucy blonde with dreadlocks, because they are finding out it is an insult today to be called white. In hip hop, white kids accept their integrated world by admiring Blackness. Now, this is key, sisters and brothers, because again, I made the case to you, there's data to prove this, that the suburbs were created in part by creating a negative stereotype of Black culture. And yet by the late 1990s, what is visible is white kids, actually the people group that some wanted their parents to be scared of, they now admire and want to dress like. I tried to talk about this, me and another youth pastor at the time, Phil Jackson, we tried to talk about this in this book called The Hip Hop Church, how hip hop culture was like influencing the entirety of youth culture in America. The funny thing is, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I had a hard time. Tiger McLuhan can vouch for me when we used to have these long conversations, sometimes with tears in my eyes, when I would go to youth specialty conventions or I would go to youth pastor conferences trying to convince the leaders. I would sit down with leaders of Youth for Christ and Young Life trying to convince them, you guys need to get your head around right now that urban youth culture is shaping all of youth culture. And they would go, ha, ha, ha. Just because they're listening to a couple rap songs, Efrem, really? And I said, you don't understand. Hip hop culture is bigger than a rap song. It's the way you talk. It's the way you dress. It's slang. It's a culture. It is not just music. It's Allen Iverson being the first basketball player to like go on the court with braids It's the Fab Five that played for Michigan in the 1990s, all wearing oversized baggy shorts. And now suburban kids want to buy gym shorts 2 sizes too big. There was a reason why when you went on the mission trip, your white young ladies wanted to braid their hair like kids from Jamaica or Haiti or the Bahamas, because they felt like in the missions trip, they finally had permission to have their hair look like Danisha and Shalika and Chandria, and they just couldn't say it when they were back home. But on the missions trip, they finally felt like they could be free enough to say, this is what I really want my hair to look like. Now, this might not be true with every kid at every level, but I'm trying to say to you that since if Patricia Hearst is right, since the mid-1990s at least, we can trace a growing African-American, urban, Black and brown influence on all of youth culture. And at the same time, there are still many stereotypes about what is urban. Like sometimes people take the worst of people in under-resourced communities and use that to present, this is what it means to be urban. And then people go, oh man. Or here's another thing that's going on in a segment of evangelicalism right now, that for some reason, the suburbs are painted as the place where the Christians are, where the people that love God and love America are. And it's in the inner city where these pagans are, where these liberal progressive, where these critical race theorists that have taken God out of school and they don't believe in God anymore. And they're trying to get our kids and our grandkids to live unbiblical and ungodly. So we've painted the inner city as like the new Black and brown Roman Empire. But the suburbs are the place where the good Christian, wholesome Americans are. And at the same time, our young people aren't buying this. Our parents might believe this. My generation might believe this about the inner city. But what I've lived in the suburbs long enough that I want to tell you guys a secret. I've met some suburban kids in good patriotic American Christian homes that do meth, that smoke weed, that get drunk. It's just when they do it, they get sent to military school, not to jail. I've seen this. I had a name, I won't say their name, but I had a family, a next door neighbor when I was living in a suburb. And their son was a drug dealer. It was obvious, a drug dealer. He did not go to jail or prison. Some van came in front of their house and some military guys came, pulled him out of the house, and he was screaming, I hate you, I hate you. And he was cussing and telling his mom and dad how much he hated them for going to military school. That saved his life. And he went on to college, and he's an upper middle class guy. I had people I grew up with that had this much weed in a Ziploc bag. They got 15 years. Because we have a different narrative about what is urban versus what is suburban. But yet our young people are being influenced beyond maybe what we want to admit by urban culture. So I say all this, that this is my big point. I think all youth pastors on some level need to become urban apologists. And what do I mean by urban apologists? I mean, one, we can help young people get beyond the stereotypes of what is the city by becoming understanders of the history of what shaped urban communities to be urban in the first place. I think if urban culture's influence in your youth, in the suburbs, in rural areas, I think you owe it to yourself to know not to get beyond the stereotypes about the city. Cities are beautiful places, Believe it or not, there are some powerful, strong, flourishing churches in the city that love God and are making disciples. There's beautiful stuff in the city. You go to the city to go to the theater. I'm not talking about like going to see, like Avengers Endgame. Like that's my thing. But like you can go into the city and see a play. You can go into the city and hear opera. You can go into the city and get a more multicultural, multi-ethnic understanding. You can go into the city and go to the museum. Like we need to help young people see not just the ashes, the protests and the riots and the brokenness. I probably have to go back and say, I said ashes, like ASHEES. Tiger would appreciate me clarifying what I just said. We don't want people just to smell the smoke and see the graffiti of the city. We want people to know the beauty, the heritage, the history of our city, that there are hardworking people in the city. And you know what, believe it or not, there are public schools where people do meet you at the pole, where they pray, where they've started Christian groups. I have been a basketball coach in the public schools, and I never compromised my Christianity, not once, because I didn't believe the stereotypes about the city because I grew up in it. There are gospel choirs in predominantly Black public high schools all over the country, and they sing hymns at homecoming. They sing gospel music at graduations. So I think we should become urban apologists to the degree of we should know the beauty and the ugly of the city. We should know the richness and the repulsiveness of the city. And we should admit that the suburbs and the rural areas have their own horror stories, have their own brokenness. And we should not, we can dispel this juxtaposition between the liberal, horrible, pagan, ungodly city versus the quote unquote wholesome, patriotic, American great suburbs. Sin is in the soul, sin is in society, and a demographic line or a geography line doesn't build a wall against systemic sin, which I'm not telling you something you don't know. But we also need to become urban apologists to the degree that if urban culture is influencing our young people in some way, how do we defend the gospel within the influence? How do we present the gospel within the influence? Because again, if you told Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that cities were just these ungodly, very liberal pagan places, if he was living today, he'd go, what are you talking about? A lot of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology on community and discipleship was shaped at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. The city is also the place of the Azusa revival, one of the most multiracial, Christ-centered, transformative movements that the United States has ever known happened in inner city Los Angeles. So we can become urban apologists by understanding, also knowing that the city is biblical. I mean, it doesn't take long reading the Bible to see the development of cities, good and bad. Matter of fact, the Bible tells us in Revelation that Jesus is coming back to build the new Jerusalem, the new Zion, the new city. No disrespect, but I can't find the word suburb anywhere in the Bible. Sorry, I can find town, village, kingdom, but city is mentioned in the Bible a lot. So I think we should all, on some degree, be urban apologists. All right, I'm going to end there, take questions, have discussion. Sorry that my PowerPoint thing didn't work out, but I hope I was able to, in some way, present with some level of clarity this idea of urbanization and its influence on youth culture.
Yeah, we're going to do some Q&A now. So you can put Q&A in the chat. You can do a little hand raise emoji. Thank you for presenting that. I would love your thoughts on, for some of our more rural workers in farming communities, smaller churches, what are some first steps that you would suggest if they've grown up away from the city to understand truly the context beyond the stereotypes? What resources would you point them to get a more robust understanding of what the urban areas actually are?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would start with is by building some relationships with urban churches and urban ministries, building some bridges. You'll find, because again, my dad is from the rural South. And as a kid, at first I hated it, but later I came to appreciate that many summers, my mom and dad sent me down to Bosco Parish, Louisiana, me and my younger brother to stay with our grandparents for the summer. But what I learned by going there was there was commonality between rural areas and inner city areas. They both have under-resourced realities. So you look at the rural, I think the rural church and the inner city church has a lot in common. Most rural churches and inner city churches have bivocational pastors. Most rural churches and inner city churches have to develop and grow youth ministries based on bivocational staff or volunteer teams. There's under-resourced schools in the rural areas, there's under-resourced schools in the inner city. So I think when you build relationships between rural and inner city churches, rural and inner city youth pastors, we'll find that we actually have much more in common than we would think. And so I think it starts with relationship building, bridge building, and then seeing the commonalities and going, wow. Because unfortunately, we live in a political landscape that, if we're honest, the major political parties often pit under-resourced people in rural areas against under-resourced people in inner city areas. So you have two groups led by rich people pitting under-resourced, hardworking, blue-collar people with calluses on their hands against each other.
Yeah, Efrem, I remember many times when you'd come in, teach in our class, or when we created the urban youth ministry class, and you led that, and you tell a story of the Tip City football game, which I always loved hearing. But as I've thought about it and I've listened since you helped me think differently, how people often would think, if I'm out of the city, I'm out of its influence, both the suburban white flight, but also, small town, rural North Dakota, that there was a sense, and I think there was in the 50s, that if I raise my children here, they're safe, they're protected from all whatever those imagery of the negative influence of the city. But through technology and music and everything that you've talked about, that the barriers between those small towns and this urban influence, and that's why I listened to you again about the urbanization is so powerful. And that story of the boys in the football game reminded me of that visually. But this is something that I really feel like that the people who think that I'm protected from those negative influences of the city, it just isn't even true at all because of technology, is it?
Yeah, the story that Tiger's referring to is I didn't get a chance for time. I didn't get a chance to really go in depth. That I've been a youth pastor in an inner city urban context, in a suburban context, and I've been a youth pastor in a suburb / small town. So I was a youth pastor at a church called Ginghamsburg Church outside of Dayton, in a city called Tip City, Ohio. And there's a high school there called Tippecanoe High School. So when I was the youth pastor at Ginghamsburg, I went to Tippecanoe High School for their homecoming football game. And it's a predominantly, almost exclusively white high school. And so when I'm leaving the football game, I see two teenage boys and they've got like cowboy boots on and cowboy hats on, and they get in a pickup truck that has a big Confederate flag sticker on it, like a huge. And then there's a gun rack in the back of the pickup. So I'm looking at them like, yeah, all the stereotypes in my mind, Dukes of Hazzard and more, are all going on in my head. They get in the pickup truck. I get in my car. They happen to be parked right next to me. They get in their pickup truck, turn on, and they start blasting Tupac. And they look at me and say, yeah, boy. And I said, what? And then one of them ended up being in the youth group. But I was like, that doesn't make sense to me. How can you get in a pickup truck with a Confederate flag sticker on it, and you're listening to Tupac at the same time? And I was like, do you know what Tupac is saying about the Confederate flag in his music? But that gave me insight into, and that was 1998. That story that happened in 1998.
Christian, I think you had your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So my question is, it actually was really fitting for what has happened in my context recently. So just to give a little bit of background into where I'm at an evangelical covenant church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In the 90s, we welcomed a bunch of South Sudanese immigrants, refugees from the Civil War over there. They came to Sioux Falls and we welcomed them into our church. And so for 30 plus years, we have had these families, and I'm the first youth pastor in a line to actually just assume that these kids are mine and claim them. Here's the question that leads to. I have students that understand, and maybe this isn't necessarily urbanization, but I have students that understand how secular culture is influencing them in all of the negative ways. But I have parents that they either don't want to believe that some of this influence from secularization, from the secularized part of the culture is having, they either don't believe it or they don't know how to address it. And so when you talked about defending the gospel, my question is, how do we help parents really understand what secular culture and social media almost exclusively is influencing these kids to challenge a Christian worldview? Because it's the students understand it, they live in it, and they'll hear me say, we have to do the long game of evangelism. You can't expect that oak tree to grow overnight. It's long term. But at the same time, they live in this culture that tells them that sex before marriage is normal and it's good and it's healthy to figure out what any of those kinds of negative things that are coming from culture now. How do I help parents to grasp that this is real and we have to equip these students to deal with it? Because it's parents that are like, I have a parent that doesn't believe that culture is teaching students that truth is relative. It's not fixed. Does that make sense when I say that?
Yes. Yeah, the great comments and question makes perfect sense to me. Here's what you will figure out in time if you stay long enough in youth ministry. So I tell people I was a youth pastor for 12 years and I've been demoted ever since. So I just progressively have been demoted all the way to co-senior pastor. But what keeps me, I think what keeps me, I don't know if just saying relevant is the right term. What keeps me feeling strengthened to keep shepherding and preaching outside of course, the Holy Spirit, the Word of God, is staying connected to adolescent culture in the United States of America in some meaningful way. And so, because this is the deal, parents can be great at raising their own kids, and they're horrible missiologists of American youth culture, just horrible, because American parents tend to go, let me create something where I can protect my kids. Like my mom, even, like I grew up in a house where my mom said, I don't care what those other kids are doing out there. This is what you're going to do. So like if I said, can I go to the movie? What time does it start? 9 p.m. No, but Tony and Kevin's going. I don't care what Tony and Kevin's doing. You're not going. Now, that part of what my mom was saying, I get, but what my mom was also acknowledging is she wasn't studying the broader youth culture of Minneapolis or South Minneapolis, or even a 3-block radius of my house. She was not doing that. But youth pastors have to do that, and then they have to help parents see it. So yes, I think there's two things. I'll try to say this real quick so we can get to more questions. One, I do believe as pastors, not just youth pastors, I think senior pastors have an obligation, and youth pastors should not have to carry this bucket by themselves. That I feel an obligation to go, I need to use my platform and my influence as a senior pastor at Midtown Church, and not just put all the pressure on Gil Escovedo, our youth and family ministry pastor, to help parents understand what is going on. So I spend time as a senior pastor saying to our entire congregation, sin is shown to us in the Bible in 3 dimensions. There's sin in the soul, which as evangelicals, we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on it. We should, because sin in the soul is real. But it's not the only dimension that the Bible presents sin in. Sin is also in Satan. So if we never talk about spiritual warfare, if we never talk about the great enemy, if we never talk about Satan, then we're not talking about sin, its totality. But the third dimension is sin in society. Biblically, that's the Tower of Babel. That's Babylon. That's Assyria. That's the Medo-Persian Empire. That's the Grecian Empire. That's the Roman Empire. That's divided, idolatrous Israel in the Bible. Sin is systemic. So we first have to help our parents understand systemic sin, and how systemic sin specifically has influence in the souls of our young people. And then that's when we start to parse it out. The only thing I would be careful of is when we talk about systemic sin and how it influences our young people, we want to make sure that we don't paint a picture that's stereotypical. What I mean by that is this. Let's take rap music, for instance. So there's definitely a part of secular rap music that is having a very negative influence on all of youth culture. No question. When you hear rap songs that talk about being at strip clubs and getting high and getting drunk and gangbanging and calling girls a B and glorifying pimping, glorifying drug dealing, of course, that is a horrible, that the N-word being used like neighbor, like we think the N-word, we use the other N-word I'm talking about. In rap music, they use that N-word like we use neighbor. in the Bible. Love your neighbor, love your. So only I could get away with this. Tiger could never have gotten away with what I just said. So, but here's the deal. We also, and again, this sounds like I'm hawking my book, but in this book, The Hip Hop Church, Phil Jackson and I talk about the real origins of hip hop culture. Do you know that hip hop culture originally, the original principles were peace, love, community, having fun, knowledge of God, knowledge of self. Hip hop culture was not created to degrade women, to glorify violence. So the other thing we need to help our parents understand is, even though I'm going to tell you all the negative influences of rap music, if you go and tell your kid they can't listen to rap music anymore, that's not how you get headway. You get headway by being a student, like Paul did in Athens. Paul went into Athens, I think that's Acts 16 or 17. He went into Athens, he studied negative pagan culture, but then he took aspects of the culture and presented Jesus through it. So we need to show parents how culture is negatively impacting youth, but we also need to do enough study to go, but there are parts of this culture that we can actually present Jesus. So instead of telling your kid to stop listening to rap, tell them about Lecrae. Actually, you can take some of Kendrick Lamar's music, like It's Gonna Be All Right, and actually learn that there's some redemptive lyrics in that song. So we just don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I took way longer to answer that question than I probably should, but I hope that was helpful.
Are there any other questions?
I can keep going.
I do think that living between the tension of parents who have a particular personal experience, as well as maybe some values and attitudes about urban influence and the images and stereotypes they have in their head, and their kids, that gap is always been huge. But in around this area, I think it comes up a lot, and youth workers are caught in the middle. We listen to kids, we try to find ways to communicate the gospel to them, and then their parents have some biases or historical experiences that it just creates a big gap. Again, it's not the first time that there's been a gap between adults, their parents and their kids, but you see this one a lot, I think, don't you, Efrem?
Yeah, and you know, I'm gonna put in the chat, I'm gonna put some titles of some books real quick, because at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying you got to go now get the equivalent of a Master's of Divinity degree in urban culture. What I am saying is, and Tiger knows this, when I was coming along, and I don't mean this in any disrespect, because it was good stuff. When I was coming along, I was taught that I needed to read Duffy Robbins and Helen Music. I needed to read David Olshine. I read Mike Yaconelli. But most of the books that I was reading about youth ministry were based on a context outside of my context. All I'm saying today is, if you had City Lights or the Hip Hop Church or Raising Up Young Heroes or Help, I'm an Urban Youth Worker on your shelf, just 2 or 3 books or resources, building relationships with some urban churches and urban youth ministries, I think that's going to give you everything you need to begin to parse some of these things out as you need it.
I think those relationships are key in this and all elements of youth ministry. We are better when we're working together and learning from one another, especially when we break beyond the classic big megachurch suburban model and really talk to other people who are doing creative things that are working in their unique contexts. So that's one of the reasons I love spaces like this, where we can come together and learn together and grow together and Efrem Smith, I thank you so much for your wisdom and insight today. It's given us all a lot to think about, and we would love your feedback. I just put some links in the chat. The first is for a feedback form. We want to create these specifically for what you're looking for. And so your feedback from today and ideas for future webinars as we craft the calendar going forward really helps us a lot. We don't want to answer questions people aren't asking. And so please let us know what you want to be talking about in these spaces. And the next link is for our next webinar coming up in May. Tiger is going to be presenting on the 7 faith factors. So rethinking discipleship and really getting at a model that sticks. So if you want to get intentional about discipleship with your kids, what are these factors that have been shown to impact faith in the long run? So registration's open for that. If you used a network code to access this webinar for free, that same code will work on the next one. So please use that, get signed up. Tiger, do you have any final thoughts before we send off for the day?
Just thanks for coming and being a part of this. And Efrem, my friend, I miss our conversations. I miss seeing you. Always good to hear from you, and I appreciate you taking your time to be with us today. So I thank you for being here, Efrem, and I thank you all for joining in. So we wish you a good day. And if there's anything that we can do at YMC to coach or train or encourage any of you, just let us know. We're here because we love every leader who cares about the next generation. So thanks, Efrem, buddy. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate you.
God bless you.